Hello, my name is Roger Watson and welcome to this session on evaluating a quantitative research article. In evaluating any research article, and a great deal of what I'm going to say here today would apply equally to qualitative research articles, you need to ask yourself why you're evaluating such an article in the first place, what it is you're evaluating, and then what the session is really based around is how do you make that evaluation. First of all, the reason we evaluate research articles at all is to try and ascertain something about their quality. Are they really good, mediocre, or really bad, for example? And this is often done in the context of reviewing papers for a systematic review. And it's done so that we can evaluate the evidence in the field. The better the research article, the better the research in it usually, and the more faith we can have in those results. And these days there are a great many ways in which we can evaluate research articles. There are a great many tools available to us. I'll look at some of these here. This is going to be by no means comprehensive, but as I say, this is usually done within the context of some kind of review, often a systematic review, where we want to see what the state of evidence is in a particular field of research. And really the only way we can do that is through the published evidence which is published in research articles. I'll probably swap between using articles and papers throughout this. It's just the same thing. In the publishing industry we tend to refer to articles, but in the academic world we tend to refer to papers, so don't get confused about that. I'll try and, wherever possible, stick to articles, but I may slip into using papers now and again, and if I do that, I apologise. So what do we evaluate in research articles? Well, we evaluate the kinds of articles that they are, and we evaluate them on that basis. Again, this list is not comprehensive, but the kinds of things that we might be reviewing are indeed reviews themselves or randomised controlled trials, and there are specific checklists for evaluating these particular kinds of designs. They should also contain particular conventions for presenting these kinds of papers, and we'll come to that later in the presentation. We also get papers on instrument development, in other words the development of questionnaires, and there are specific things that you would expect to see there. Qualitative studies, which won't form a part of this particular presentation, but we will have to evaluate those. And again, there are tools to evaluate those, but if you want to see what the good aspects of a qualitative paper should look like, then it's just as well to learn how to write a qualitative paper properly. And this YouTube presentation here by one of the Journal of Advanced Nursing editors, Mark Hayter, and one of our colleagues at the University of Hull, is very good. You can also access it on the Journal of Advanced Nursing webpage under the author guidelines, well worth taking a look at. I won't deal any further with qualitative papers in this presentation. There are also cohort studies and other kinds of experimental and quantitative studies, and of course there are surveys. So how do we assess a paper? Well, this is just an overview. First of all, we need to read the paper. Usually if you're assessing papers for review purposes, you do need to read them very carefully from end to end, but there are some main features that we need to look at, and we'll go through the structure of a typical quantitative paper, or article should I say, later in the presentation. Then we can compare it with other articles in the field and say whether it's good or bad or better or worse. And finally, we do need to assess the papers, and there are formal means for doing this for most kinds of papers. One of the possible exceptions is survey papers. As at the time of writing this session, there are no formal criteria for assessing surveys in the same way as there are, for example, for randomised controlled trials, cohort studies and review papers. So which aspects of a research article should we evaluate? Well, one of the things that we can have a look at is the authors. However, I put a question mark there. There's a famous book called Nursing Research by Desmond Cormack originally, and there are now updated editions authored and edited by Gerrish and Lacey, and they give criteria for assessing research articles, and one of the things that they say should be assessed is who wrote the article. I tend to disagree. I think it doesn't matter who wrote the article, it's the content of the article and the research that's being reported that's more important. And we can assume if the article has been published in a reasonable journal, then all the necessary criteria have been met. For authorship of any article, it isn't usually a criterion that you have to be particularly qualified or a particular level of qualification. And in fact, reviewers in double-blind peer review systems are blind to that. So I wouldn't put too much emphasis on who the authors are, although it's always interesting to see who they are. It's much more important to assess the journal. I put a question mark there, but there's really no question mark about it. We do need to be very careful these days, particularly with the rise of online publishing and predatory publishers of the kinds of journals that we're looking at. So we could ask ourselves, are the authors famous? Are they accomplished in their field? Are they controversial? And certainly controversial authors may be worth watching. They're always interesting to read, but they may be trying to spin a line or take an angle. However, for research articles, this shouldn't really be an issue if they're following formal criteria. Clearly, if you think they're not following the criteria properly and trying to make a point, or they're biased in some way, then that would lower your assessment of the article, of course. In terms of the journal, there are many things we can look at. Is it international? International journals tend to be better than local or domestic or national journals, or even specialist clinical journals. Is the journal refereed? And I'll come to the refereeing process later. This is crucial. If the journal isn't refereed, if there hasn't been some kind of review process of the papers in the articles in the journal by experts, then you've really got to ask some questions about it. Does it have an impact factor? Now, an impact factor is a measure of the citations to the journal. It's a very controversial measurement because of the way it's formulated. That doesn't need to concern us here. It's also very controversial whether journals with higher impact factors are of higher quality than other journals. That doesn't really matter. The fact that a journal has an impact factor, or these days is on the emerging journals list, which is journals which are just about to be awarded an impact factor, it tells you something about the journal. It tells you they have an international editorial board and they have a peer review process and that they meet certain publishing standards. And also, is the journal open access? Now, open access doesn't mean to say that it's bad, but some open access journals are very poor indeed. And in terms of open access, you want to be confining yourself to Biomed Central and PLOS One, which are two companies which publish a range of open access journals, usually in the medical field. But all the major publishers, and I'm going to name them here, there may be others, but Elsevier, Wiley, Sage, Springer, all of these publishers offer open access policies for traditional journals, but they also offer open access journals in particular fields. So they are okay, but there are other open access journals which you need to be very aware of, and we'll come back to looking at the criteria you can use to judge that later. In terms of the specific features of a journal, which tell us a great deal about research articles published in it, there are a range of things we can look at. For example, is the journal a member of COPE? COPE is the Committee on Publication Ethics. It's an international committee, mainly applies to medical journals and related journals, but there are other journals which adhere to COPE guidance as well. And that tells us that the journal has to meet certain standards. COPE journals have to meet a range of standards before they're accepted into COPE membership. Now, there are journals which are good, there are journals which have impact factors which are not members of COPE, but I think it's well worth knowing if they are. For example, journals which are a member of COPE cannot ask authors to cite the journal. They shouldn't in any case. There are journals outside the COPE membership which still do that. That's not really something that should concern you when you're assessing an article, but it tells you something about the journal. Does it subscribe to the ICMJE definitions of authorship, the International Committee of Journal Editors? That's worth knowing as well. You can have a look at the guidance for the journal just to see if it does. This means that it tries to discourage a gift authorship of people who shouldn't be authors, and it tries to encourage inclusion of people who definitely should be authors. Again, the details don't concern us here. You could take a look at that. These are all just things that you might want to have a look at in terms of the background to the journals. You may not always have time to do this if you're doing a review as a student, for example, but if you're doing a full systematic review, these are things that you really want to try and be aware of if you suspect there are any problems with articles in a journal. Does it insist on including the ethical aspects of the study? Now, most journals should these days, and certainly good journals, those within the COPE membership for sure, insist on having a statement about the ethical aspects of the study, and without it, the study shouldn't or couldn't or shouldn't be published. Do they publish randomised controlled trials? And if they do they adhere to the All Trials campaign, which insists that all trials are published, whether the results are positive or not, and that all trials are registered in advance and that the protocols are registered? Again, you can take a look at the All Trials campaign. I'll mention it again later and show you the web page. Do they ask for a conflict of interest statement? This should easily be seen at the end of the article. If there's not a conflict of interest, it doesn't mean to say that there's anything wrong. And if there is a conflict of interest statement, again, it doesn't mean to say that there's anything wrong. Conflicts of interest should be declared so that anyone reading the article can assess it in that light. But again, you may want to find out if the journal does ask for conflicts of interest statements, and that should be clear in their guidance. And in fact, for any good quality journal, there should be a very good quality set of guidance for that journal. Do they adhere to international publishing standards? There are lots of these. They are published on the Equator web page. There's a whole list of standards there, and they're growing all the time, but the main ones are the PRISMA guidance for systematic reviews and the consort guidance for randomised controlled trials, and we'll look specifically at the consort guidance briefly later on in this session. Okay, let's just be clear about the peer review process. I've mentioned this already a few times, and it's highly relevant to the quality of the journals you'll be looking at, and that's highly relevant to the quality of the articles you'll be reading. So it's just as well that you know something about it. The peer review process is a cyclical process. It begins with the author submitting a paper. Peer reviewers will look at the paper on behalf of the journal, and the publishers will then process those reviews. It will go back to the authors for consideration, but ultimately the point of the process is to help authors to produce the best possible articles, and for those who read them, the scholarly and the clinical community, or anyone who wants to read the articles, to be given the best possible information. It's not a perfect process, but it works pretty well. As I say, it's meant to be cooperative. Authors don't always feel that it is. And there are two types of peer review. There is blind peer review and there's now open review. And within the blind peer reviewing, the most common type of review, certainly within nursing, is double-blind peer review, where the authors don't know the reviewers and the reviewers don't know the authors. But there are variations on this of single blinding, and there are controversies about what's good and what's bad. Needn't concern us here, but the most common type of reviewing process is double-blind peer review. However, there is now open peer review, and this is practiced by the open access journals within the Biomed Central group of journals. And it's interesting. In this process, the authors and the reviewers are known to each other, and the reviews are published, and the responses to the reviews are published. So the whole process of producing the final published article is very transparent. This is fairly new, and I don't think it's really been evaluated properly. But of course, if you're evaluating particular articles, it may be of great interest to look at those particular reviews. But of course, this is only something that's available with a very limited number of journals. Mostly people tend to favour double-blind peer review as a system which protects the reviewers' identities, it protects the authors from prejudice, and therefore is seen to be potentially the best system. However, there are advantages to open peer review, but again, doesn't necessarily need to concern us here. Now, I've already mentioned the Equator guidance, and Equator stands for Enhancing the Quality and Transparency of Health Research. Well worth having a look at the Equator website, which is easily Googled. On there you'll find a range of guidance for all kinds of studies. This is not guidance for evaluating studies, this is a guidance for presenting studies. However, the fact that particular journals insist on the guidance being contained in the articles reporting particular kinds of studies is certainly an indicator of quality. Now, the only guidance I want to look at here is the consort guidance, and the consort guidance is concerned with presenting randomized controlled trials, or in fact any kind of experimental work. And of course there's a specific web page, but it can be accessed through the Equator web page too. If you access the consort web page, it looks like this. That's the consort web page, and you can see that it's got a range of documents there. At the top it's got a checklist, and the checklist is a checklist for authors to complete honestly and to submit along with the manuscripts to the journal, for reviewers and the journal to be sure that the correct criteria, all the aspects of a randomized controlled trial have been reported properly. And there's also a flow diagram below that, and the flow diagram is there to assure that everybody who could possibly be included in the randomized controlled trial and everyone who dropped out and who completed it is accounted for. And it's very easy, if you're looking at a randomized controlled trial paper, to see, first of all, is there a mention of adhering to the consort statement? If there is, that's a good sign. If there is, or even if there's not, the next thing to look for is the consort flow diagram. That's a very good thing to check. If a randomized controlled trial is reported without that flow chart, then that's a very poor indicator of quality. And the flow chart looks like this. So the flow chart is there for everybody who's eligible to be in the trial to be numbered, and then those who were actually selected got through the selection criteria or the inclusion criteria. Then the people who were randomized to the various arms of the study. Here there are two, but you can add other arms if you wish. And then everybody who completed the trial, and all the dropout needs to be accounted for. People drop out for all sorts of reasons. They don't want to take part any longer. Some people die, people just get lost to follow up. This allows a particular analysis called intention to treat. Again, the details of that don't need to concern us here, but you may come across that terminology in a randomized controlled trial. It's just a way of accounting for the dropout in the trial to see if it had any more effect on one arm of the trial than the other. So it's well worth having a look out for the consort guidance, for example, if you're looking at a randomized controlled trial. I also mentioned the All Trials campaign. If you want to know more about the All Trials campaign, then they have a website, and it's well worth having a look at. And it's well worth looking to see if the journal that you're looking at is signed up to this campaign. The journal should be quite proud to proclaim that in its guidance and request that authors follow the All Trials guidance if they're publishing randomized controlled trials, but you can also check independently. The journal may not be named as such, but the publisher, for example, will be. So, for example, for the Journal of Advanced Nursing, we're within the Wiley stable, and Wiley have signed up to the All Trials campaign, so every journal in the Wiley stable should adhere to the All Trials criteria. Now, it's sometimes the case that they don't do this so well, or some do it better than others. However, the fact that a journal is signed up to the All Trials campaign is a really good sign. There are a range of evaluation tools. I'm going to look at the two main groups of tools here. There are others, but these are the ones that people mainly use. The first set of tools are called CASP, and CASP is the Critical Appraisal Skill Program, and they offer a wide range of critical appraisal tools for different kinds of studies, and you can download these and you can use them. They offer tools for randomized controlled trials, for cohort studies, qualitative studies, and for reviews. So here's the complete list, and they're easily available and free to use. We don't have time to go into how to use these tools in detail, but they're just a guide to assessing articles. They're not complete in and of themselves. You need to read the articles, and you do need to use these instruments, make some judgments as well. But they're a good, as it were, bottom line for finding out if certain features of particular studies are present. There's also a group of tools coming under the Scottish Intercollegiate Guidelines Network, or SIGN. And that's the SIGN webpage, and SIGN produces a very similar range of instruments. Now, the SIGN guidance is slightly different. You can use it to evaluate articles by all means, but really it's there to help people to produce consensus guidelines, so it's not exactly the same necessarily as systematic reviewing, although it's very similar. You can use either of these, just depending on which you find easier to use, for example, and there's no reason why you can't mix them up if you're looking at different kinds of studies. I have to say that I think the CASP tools are the ones that are most commonly used and probably seen as the gold standard. But again, the SIGN guidelines offer a range of checklists for quantitative studies, cohort studies, case control studies, and systematic reviews. Now, so far that's really just some background for you about the quality of journals, reflecting on the quality of the articles they contain, and I've also given you a couple of examples of appraisal tools which you may or may not wish to, or may not be able to use, but I would strongly advise it. However, what I want to go through next, before we finish off on some other material, is reading a research article, particularly a quantitative one, and looking at the different aspects of it. I mean, this is the real work of evaluating an article. The background and the tools for evaluating papers are really only an aid to this process. So in turn, I want to look at the different aspects of a research article, and these are the title, the abstract, the introduction, the background, if it does have a background, I'll tell you about that later, the methods, the results, the discussion, conclusion if it has one, and possibly even the references. I don't think I'm going to mention references in much detail, but it is always interesting to look at the references an article contains. For example, you can see if they're up to date at the time the article was written, or if the journal may restrict them to only presenting certain articles, or the articles that they've looked at may be biased to your knowledge. So that's always something worth looking at, but mainly I want to look at the points about the paper above that, and these are all things that you can use in your evaluation of a research article. First of all, the title of the article. We're just going to go through these criteria quite quickly because they're quite easy for you to evaluate. But first of all, the title should be as short as possible. Be wary of very long titles. Some journals restrict the number of words or the number of characters. Sometimes the number of words is about 15 or so, or only a couple of lines of text. But to articles with titles that are very long are usually quite difficult to understand. And of course, the title should be clearly related to the topic of the paper. If the title is obscure or too literary or too fancy or trying to be funny or asking a question, then that's not a good sign. However, it doesn't necessarily tell you much about the actual content of the article, but it is something to take into account. All good journals ask that the articles have abstracts. Now, the best abstracts are structured, usually 250 to 300 words. The structure should be obvious in the subheadings that are used, but some are not. But even so, there should be an obvious structure to the abstract, and whether or not there's a structure will be specified by the journal, and the number of words will be specified by the journal. But the things that you should be able to see in the abstract are the aims and objectives of the study, some background, why the study is being done, a clear statement of the design. For example, is it a randomized controlled trial or a survey or a cohort study? That should be clearly stated. Then the methods section should describe the methods clearly. For example, it should describe, if it's a survey, it should describe the methods of data collection. Was it by questionnaire or interview? And a key piece of information here is the number of people involved in the study. The results should be clear and succinct. They shouldn't necessarily contain the statistical results. They should give you an idea of the results. For example, if it's a randomized controlled trial, they should tell you if the new treatment is better than the old one, and leave it at that. Then you can look at the article for the actual statistical data. And there should be some kind of conclusion, what the article means. Some of these pieces of information will of course be repeated in the main article, because of course they're taken from it, but the abstract can tell you a lot. And if the abstract is not very clear, that's often a sign of a very poor quality article altogether. If they're not clear in the abstract about what the paper means and what they did and what the results are, they're likely to be unclear in the main body of the article. The introductory section to an article is important. Some articles have an introduction and a background. Some have just an introduction and some only have a background. However, whatever they have at this initial opening part of an article, there should be at least a part of it which is introducing the article. And an introduction should place the study that's being reported in its widest possible context. For example, is it a policy study? Is it a practice study? Is it purely research? Or is it education, for example? So there should be some broad statement. The introduction shouldn't begin with details. So you should be able to place the study in some broad context. For example, it may refer to some new government report or some new policy that's come out or some change in practice that's being investigated. So if you're not clear from the introduction where the paper sits in terms of its context, again, that's a negative point, as it were. The introduction should contain a problem statement, and the problem statement, it may not be called a problem statement, but you should be able to ascertain the following. What is the problem? What's being investigated? Why is the problem worth studying? Why are they studying the problem? What's given rise to this? Is it a systematic review? Is it a policy imperative or whatever? And for that they can refer back to the opening and the introduction. And why would anyone, especially you, be interested? If it doesn't grab your attention, then there's something wrong. Next, the background, or the next section of whatever the opening section of the article is called. The background should make it clear to you what's already known about the topic and what gaps this particular article will fill, or that the study fills. And that may be on the basis of a literature review, not necessarily a systematic one, but this is where the bulk of the literature that's relevant to the study should be brought in. They should also identify the questions to be addressed in the article, and a good background section should end with the research questions, or perhaps the hypotheses that are being investigated, although the hypothesis may be explicated further on in the methods section. Now, a research question is a question. In other words, it has a question mark at the end of it, and many people get this wrong. For example, research grant awarding bodies will not usually award a grant if there's not a clear research question around which the rest of the proposal is based, and most good journals expect to see a research question in their research articles. Now, the research question is very important. Not only may the hypothesis in a quantitative study be derived from that question, but more importantly, the design follows from the research question, and from the design follows the methods and then the analysis, and that's all got to be coherent. So a good research question, clearly stated, is a really, really good sign in a research article. If it's not there, again, as far as I'm concerned, that's minus points. So it should be a clear statement in the form of a question of what the investigators have set out to investigate. For example, are practice nurses better than general practitioners at removing earwax? Does continuing professional development improve nurses' management skills? And why do older nurses leave the profession? Those are all very clear questions. They're all very different questions, and they'd all be investigated in very different ways. This can be differentiated from hypotheses, which are, for example, there will be a relationship between X and Y. There will be a difference between X and Y. X will be better than Y at. The difference between a research question and an hypothesis is that a hypothesis dictates the particular kinds of statistical tests that will be used to test that hypothesis. A good methods section should cover the following. It should have a clear statement of the design. This may well be repeated from the abstract. The methods should include the sample, the data collection, and the analysis. And these days it's conventional to include a statement about ethics. For the design in a quantitative article, this can really only be a randomized controlled trial and the variations thereof, or a survey. Should state the type of design. Is it cross-sectional or longitudinal, and a brief rationale for the choice of the design. Not a treatise on methods here, or any kind of debate between qualitative and quantitative methods, but just a brief statement. For example, this is the appropriate method to investigate this because. This may not necessarily be included, but for more exotic designs and for some, especially some more complicated statistical methods, it may be necessary to make some statement like this. But however, there should be some, if there is one at all, a brief rationale for this choice of design, not a long explanation. In terms of the sample, the population from which the sample was drawn should be stated. So if it's a sample of patients, were they taken from the community or from the hospital, and what was the size of that population. There has to be a clear statement of why people were included and why people were excluded. And there also needs to be some kind of statement about the type of sampling, which we'll cover in a second, giving you some examples. That has to be stated, and also how did they gain access to participants? Was it random? Was it done by, for example, in a hospital, asking managers to distribute questionnaires to members of staff, or were you given random access to them? Because these things will matter. Nothing's really right or wrong. That's a bold statement, I know, but it's not a case of being right or wrong. It's a case of stating clearly what they did so that you can interpret the results correctly and ascribe the right level of confidence to that particular article. So for sampling, it may have been random, but that's not enough. Was it simple random, or cluster random, or stratified? There are other random designs like block designs and so forth. They're quite complex. In any case, you may not necessarily fully understand these designs, but there should be a clear statement of what kind of design it was, and then you need to be able to know if that was good or bad in terms of the generalizability of the results in the article. Or was the sample obtained sequentially? Was it obtained by convenience? And also, very important in any quantitative paper, is there any sample size consideration? Specifically, I mean, was there a power calculation? This is absolutely essential in randomized controlled trials in order to get the right number of people for the trial, but in surveys as well, you've got to know if the sample is representative, and for any statistical tests that are used, you need to know if the sample was big enough for the investigators to carry out those tests with any degree of confidence. In terms of data collection, they need to say which instruments are used and why they were used briefly. They have to make some sort of statement about the reliability and validity of the instruments. This could just be a reference to other works if these are gold standard instruments, for example, like the General Health Questionnaire. You don't need to go through the details there. But if it's a homegrown instrument, they need to state the extent to which they themselves have ascertained the reliability and the validity. And if the questionnaires have been translated, they need to go through that process and explain it. There are standard procedures, for example, for forward and back translation. It's not enough to say an instrument was translated, because translation can change an instrument, both in terms of the language and the culture in which it's being used. Now, just very briefly, if they've considered reliability, they need to say what type. Did they look at internal consistency, test, retest, intra-rater or inter-rater? Those are the possibilities. So they need to specify one of those. In terms of validity, they don't need to do all of these tests, but they need to be clear what they've looked at. And they're always looking at construct validity, but how did they do that? Did they look at content, criterion, discriminant, or factorial validity, for example? You don't necessarily need to know every detail about these methods, but they should at least make a statement about them. And they may or may not go into them in much detail, but if they do mention validation of an instrument, and especially if they've done it themselves, they need to make it clear what they've done. For the analysis, clearly they need to specify the tests and the calculations that were used. They can't just present the results without doing this. And they also need, in the case of quantitative articles, to state which statistical packages were used, and they need to give the version, because statistical packages do evolve over time and some of them give slightly different results, and if the article's been reviewed by a statistician, they need to know that. But for someone who's evaluating the article like yourself, you need to be clear, did they actually state these things? If they did, that's a good sign. If they didn't, I would say that's a point taken off the article. In the results section, the results should just be stated and not discussed. The descriptive statistics of any should be given. First of all, inferential statistics, any relationships within the data, and if they've used multivariate statistics to look at structures and causes, these should be reported, and the best thing is to, if they've reported all of these, they should be reported in that order. Not all of these kinds of statistics will be relevant to every paper, but if they have done just purely a survey and looking at the demographics, then they need to give those data very clearly. All tables and figures should be referred to. That brings us nicely to the issue of tables and figures. Tables and figures should not use raw statistical outputs from, for example, SPSS packages. They should be parsimonious. They should contain as much information as possible in as little space as possible, but they shouldn't be complicated and difficult to understand. And it's really good practice these days to append additional material online, and that additional material, and this will become increasingly good practice, should include, for example, databases and even statistical syntax and coding. Here's an example of a figure that's extremely complicated. It may mean something to people who already understand some of these issues, but you would never expect to see something like that published in a journal article. Here's a table that's, again, might mean something to people who understand what's already in the table, but that's not a very good table. That's very difficult to understand. This is not much good either, unless you really understand already what's in the table. On the other hand, here's a really good example of a table, and everything that you need to know about the table is there. The title tells you what the question is that's being asked. You can see how many people over a range of years were in favour, opposed and didn't know the answer, and it gives you the demographics at the bottom. So again, you can evaluate a table to some extent on the way the tables are presented. If they're very complicated to understand, then it's very difficult to evaluate the article. Now, closing the circle. This is how I always envisage the discussion. It should close the circle. It should take the paper, in a sense, back to the beginning and put the results in the context of the whole paper. So it should discuss the findings to the research questions, and only those and no other ones. And it shouldn't take us to some other place that the author wants to speak about. It should deal solely with the findings to the research questions, and these, of course, should be discussed in the context of the literature that was reviewed in the background, and some new literature perhaps that may be brought in here that helps to explain the results. Limitations should be included. Do have a look at these. I tend to find that undergraduate students are very harsh on articles and tend to find faults and limitations where maybe there aren't any. Do have a look and check to see if the authors have already mentioned these. But they should be realistic. If there are limitations, they should be stated. Limitations are often quite simply that the sample size wasn't quite big enough, or the study isn't very generalizable, something like that. The findings shouldn't be overstated, and this is very important because one experiment in one hospital in the UK doesn't solve the problems of the whole National Health Service, for example. The study should be presented in context, and the results should be presented in the context of the study itself. But they should include implications and recommendations, and these should relate right back to the introduction to the widest context of the article. They should relate back to the policy, practice, education, or whatever context the study was placed in. And finally, they should relate back to the aims of the study and where they achieved. The aims of the study would be brought up probably in the introduction or in the discussion, but whatever they were setting out to do, did they manage to do it? And in fact, this is something, if they don't state it, you should be able to ascertain this, and it's a plus for the paper if they've actually stated this themselves. But you could evaluate this, and if it's not attained, then that's not necessarily a negative point for the paper, but it's a negative point if they haven't been clear about the extent to which they have or they haven't achieved the aims in the paper. Now, if there is a conclusion, then it should be a brief summary of what the paper shows, and I mean brief. It should give the main implications of the paper and any future lines of inquiry that may be followed. Most papers suggest that more research is needed. Well, this should be clearly stated in the conclusions. It may well be already stated in the discussion, but this is a place to restate it. There shouldn't be any references here or any new ideas. It should clearly be a conclusion to the paper in question. Now, a final word on open access journals. If you're in any doubt about the veracity of the journal, whether it's, as we say, bona fide, if it's reputable, then, and it's an open access journal, it's one of these reputedly open access journals rather than a journal which offers open access facilities. For example, I edit a journal called Nursing Open on behalf of Wiley, and that is an open access journal. These journals are free to read online because you pay to publish your article once it's been accepted. If you're in any doubt about open access articles, which I mentioned earlier on, or specifically about the journal, check the directory of open access journals to see if the journal is on there. If it is, that's usually a good point, or a plus in terms of the journal. If it's not there, you should be very suspicious. Which are on there should contain a green tick next to them. For example, the third one down there is Nursing Open, my own journal, and that's got a green tick next to it. And if it's got that, it means it's been in existence for over a year, it's got a peer review process, and so forth. And it's well worth checking this. So thank you very much for listening to this presentation. That's my email if you've got any comments or questions. My ORCID number is there if you want to check up on my own publication and research record. And if you've really got nothing else to do, you're welcome to follow me on Twitter. Once again, thank you very much for listening.